Okay, so these suffixes, we've got two groups of suffixes. One group goes on the singular nouns, and the other group goes on the plural nouns. And yes, it's a lot of endings to keep track of, but if you can just find the common thread between the two groups. So, for example, third masculine singular pronoun endings have a vav. The ones that go on the singular nouns, the first group, it's a holem vav. The second group, it's a kametz yod vav, but there's a vav either way. So if you can just associate vav with third masculine singular, that'll really help. For third feminine singular, both the first group and the second group, they both have a kametz and a hey. So in the first group that goes on the singular nouns, that's a kametz hey with a mapik. In the second group, it's a hey kametz, but there's still a hey and there's still a kametz in both 3fs endings. So that would be what you kind of keep in your head. To keep it even more simple, you might just remember the hey ending is that 3fs ending, and that should be relatively easy because we're used to that with the feminine singular endings on nouns and adjectives. For 2ms, again, it's the kaf kametz. The only difference between the two is that the second group, the one that goes on the plural nouns, has a yod as well. And same for 2fs. It's basically just a kaf shava. 1cs, it's going to be a yod. If it goes on a singular noun, it's hirik yod. If it goes on a plural noun, it's patach yod. But it's a yod either way. So just when you see just a yod ending, you can kind of put in your brain that that's 1cs. And then that vowel will tell you whether the noun is singular or plural. When it comes to the plurals, we've got 3MP. There's going to be a mem associated with 3MP. In the first group, it's kametz mem. In the second group, it's hey segel mem, but it's a mem either way. 3FP, it's going to be a noon. Okay, so you've got kametz noon in group 1, hey segel noon in group 2, but it's a noon either way, so just associate noon with 3FS here. The 2MP and 2FP are pretty much identical. Kaf segel mem and kaf segel noon. The only difference between group 1 and group 2 is that group 2, which goes on plural nouns, is going to have that yod in there. And then finally, 1CP is going to be a noon shurik. All right, and again, the group 2 that goes on plural nouns will have a yod before the noon shurik, but that should keep you pretty straight there. If you can just focus in on those common features that both groups of suffixes will have in each person-gender combination, you should be able to keep them relatively simplified in your head. All right, so let's go over and look at these exercises now. All right, so looking at these words, it tells us right off the bat that these are going to be words with possessive suffixes. It doesn't tell us in the instructions whether or not these are singular nouns or plural nouns, so we want to keep an eye out for that. But again, as I go through here, I'm just going to point out what I see immediately that helps me. Okay, so first I see a vav, I think 3ms. All right, that's going to be his, and then whether it's horse or horses is going to depend on this yod here. It's a kametz yod vav instead of a holem vav, and so that means it's his horses. This is plural. Number 2, chem, so I know this is your masculine plural. Again, I see a yod between sus and chem, so I know that this is horses, so your horses. Susenu, again, nu is going to be our, all right? And so the yod here between sus and susenu tells me that this is our horses, not our horse. Susechem, hem has that mem, which reminds me of them, masculine. All right, so hem equals, not, I shouldn't say them, it's there, but hem and them, that's how I remember the pronoun, the subject pronoun there. So hem here just means their, masculine plural, and the sere yod indicates that sus is plural. So this would be their horses. Number 5, I have cha. Cha means 2ms, so this is going to be your, masculine singular, and the yod before the susech, the susecha, this here, this is going to be a plural form. So this is you, masculine singular, your horses. So here, this is a good example of how the number of the suffix is independent from the number of the noun. All right. If this were just your horse, singular, this would be susecha. This, we would have a shava under this second samek, no yod, and then we would have cha. Number 6, we see a yod, so I think 1cs, I think my. And then to determine whether horse is singular or plural here, the patach tells us that it's plural. If this were my horse, it would be susi. Number 7, very similar to number 5, except it is 2fs now. So this is your feminine singular. Again, here, this is going to be horses, your horses, because we've got this eich suffix. I'm pretty sure that it would be susech, but let me check that here if it were your horse. Going back up. Those are feminine. Oh, these are all plural. Here we go. Yeah, susech. It would be a sere kaf shava, but there's no yod there. All right. So that was number 7. Number 8 here, again, I've got the ha suffix. So that tells me 3 fs, her. And I know that this is her horses because I've got the yod here. Number 9, we've got avdechem. Avdechem, chem. That tells me it is you, masculine plural, your. And this is going to be servants, plural, because I've got the sere yod after what is originally evet here. Number 10, nashotehem. Now, this is the good news. If this noun takes feminine endings, it's going to be so much easier to tell whether the noun is singular or plural. The tricky part is when it's masculine, because the masculine noun doesn't change a lot when it goes from construct to absolute in the plural. But here, we've got nafshotehem, and that oat ending here sticks out like a sore thumb. You should immediately recognize this as souls. I know that's trickier with the masculine, but that yod will still give it away. And so here we also see the sere yod ending even after the oat ending of the plural. So this is going to be their, masculine plural, souls or lives, plural. Number 11, we've got zahavenu. Zahavenu is going to be gold. I think gold is zahav. Zehav ze gold. That's how I remember that. Assuming that this is gold, we've got the new suffix. This is going to be our gold, but it's plural. Now, how in the world would you pluralize their golds? Number 12, we've got devarav. Devarav is davar, and then we've got the vav here, which tells me it's his. All right, but is it his word or is it his words? Well, the yod here indicates that davar is going to be plural, so this is his words. Number 13, we've got mishpatecha. Mishpatecha is going to be mishpat, which is judgment or decision. It's cha, which is you, masculine singular, but it's your decisions, plural, because we've got the segel hey here, or I'm sorry, the segel yod. So that yod tells us that mishpat is plural. Number 14, avotaich. Here we've got the kaf shava ending, which is 2 fs. And then we've got the yod in the suffix, so that tells us that avot, even though we can clearly see the ot ending here, avot is going to be plural fathers, so this would be you, feminine singular, your fathers. Now here it's probably ancestors, because, well, it's probably ancestors. All right, number 15, we've got makomotai. I think the accent here is on the otai, makomotai. The yod tells me 1 cs, my, and so if we've got my, makom, ot, makom is going to be like a location, a place, makom, but this is the construct form in the feminine plural form. So my places is what this. We've got number 16 here, yadav. Yadav here is yad for hand, and it's got the vav, that tells me it's his hand, but the yod suffix, yod in the suffix, and again, it's technically, is the yod part of the suffix or is it part of the word? I guess you've got sort of a double suffix here. It's part of the construct suffix, and then the vav would be part of the pronoun suffix. But either way, the yod in there confirms that yad is yadim, and then in the construct, you get, with the pronoun suffix, you get yadav. So this would be his hands. All right, so number 1, again, the pattern or the procedure that I'm going to use if I've got a sentence in Hebrew is I'm going to anticipate that I've got a verb at the beginning. That's not always going to be the case, but it kind of helps me when I see a word at the beginning that I don't recognize. If I think this is a verb, now I can start thinking, okay, what endings, what prefixes might be here. For me, it's helpful, but you may take a different approach. So if I look at beniti, I think to myself, I never learned the word beniti. I have no idea what this is. But if I think, well, this is some form of a verb, then that helps me narrow down what it could be. So if this is a verb, I ask myself, how many letters does the Hebrew verbal root have? 3. How many do I have? I have 5 here. So I've definitely got extra letters. So I ask myself, what's extra? Do we add a bait to the beginning of verbs? Well, now that we're in infinitives, we learn that you can have a bait at the beginning of an infinitive, but if this were an infinitive, we still wouldn't have a root here. So bait is probably not a prefix in this situation. Well, if it's not a prefix, then it's probably part of the root. Okay, so maybe this is my first root letter. All right, what about hirik yod? Do I ever add hirik yod to the end of a verb when I conjugate? And again, we will, toward the end of the semester, we will talk about these same, what we're now calling possessive suffixes, or pronoun suffixes that indicate possession when they're added to nouns. These suffixes can also be added to verbs to indicate the object of the verb. We'll get to that later on down the road. So in that situation, we would have a hieroc yod that makes sense, but we're not going to worry about that right now because we haven't learned it yet. But what have we learned about hieroc yods at the end of words? Well, we have learned that the perfect conjugation has a tav hieroc yod suffix in the 1cs form. And sure enough, I have tav hieroc yod here. But in the imperfect, the second feminine singular also has a hieroc yod, just hieroc yod. So is this the cal perfect 1cs with the tav hieroc yod suffix? Or is this tav part of the root and we have a cal imperfect 2fs with a hieroc yod suffix? Well, if it's imperfect, we would expect to see a prefix, and we don't see a prefix here. Because again, we decided that bait was part of our root. There's no prefix in front of bait. There's no prefix. I mean, if it's part of the root, it needs to be before the bait. So this then would be the cal perfect, which does not have a prefix. It would be the 1cs form. So if we take off the t suffix, what are we left with? Well, we do have 3 letters, which a Hebrew verbal root would have 3 letters, but the third letter is yod, and that is not something that we've not learned any verbs that have yod as the third root letter. Here's something, just another rule to jot down somewhere if you're going to say, the 100 most important rules to remember in Hebrew. Then one of those rules would be, if you get to your verbal root and the third root letter is a yod, then that is an indication that you've actually got a third hey verb here. Because, and again, it may be that the third hey verbs way back in Hebrew used to be third yods and then the yod morphed into a hey. That may be, but we're not worried about the historical development of the language at this point. Just connect that third yod letter with a third hey. Because you'll remember that third hey verbs, when you add a consonantal suffix, that is a suffix that begins with a consonant, when you add a consonantal suffix to a third hey verb, that comet's hey ending in the cal perfect, that actually shifts to a hieroc yod. All right, so that's what we've got here. If we replace the yod with a hey, we get bait nun hey. And bait nun hey is a verbal root that we've learned, bana, which means he built. Here, bana is in the 1CP of the cal perfect. 1CS of the cal perfect. And so that would mean I built. All right, so remember, I built, the verb itself doesn't mean I built. The verb itself means built. It's understood that I is the subject here because this form only occurs when the subject is the 1CS. But we don't have an explicit pronoun here for the subject. We don't have an explicit subject here. All we have is the et particle, which here, this is an indication of a definite direct object. Now I pause there because I expect to see a hey in front of the noun if it's a definite direct object, and there's no hey here. Why is there no hey? Well, remember, there are 4 ways that a Hebrew noun can be definite. One is if it has the definite article. If a Hebrew noun has the definite article, it's definite. Another way a Hebrew noun can be definite is if it is a proper noun. That would be like place names or people names, something like that. Those are definite because they're referring to a specific place or a specific person, but they don't get the definite article. Like, we don't say, the Daniel is teaching this course. We don't say, the Kansas is where I live. For place names, people names, we just say the name, and it's understood because it's a specific place or a specific person that it's definite, okay? So a Hebrew noun is definite if it has the definite article, or if it's a proper noun, or if it is in construct with a noun that is definite. So if it's in construct and the absolute of that chain is definite, then all of the construct nouns are also definite, but they will not have the article. And finally, the 4th way that a noun may be definite is if it has a possessive suffix on it, which is what we have here. This isn't just any mizbeach or any mizbachot. This isn't just any mizbachot. These are your mizbachot, all right? And so these are specific, so they are definite, but when you have this possessive suffix, you're not going to have the definite article on the noun. So this definite direct object marker is proper. It is marking the direct object of the verb, and that direct object is definite, even though it doesn't have the article. We know it's definite because these are your mitzbechot. All right, so we've got built, someone built, and we know that that someone is 1CS. So in English, we have to supply a subject. So we would supply the subject pronoun I in English. I built. What did I build? Et mizbechotecha. That's a long Hebrew word. But we've got mitzbechot, which comes from mizbeach. Mizbeach is altar. So these are altars, and they are your You, singular, masculine singular, 2ms. Your altars. I built your altars, and I just realized that I've uncovered the answer. So, I built your altars. All right, looking at number 2 here, we have not to new here. And if we look at this word and assume that it's a verb, we can ask ourselves, how many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? The Hebrew verbal root has 3, and we have 4, so something is extra. Do we ever add a noun to the beginning of a Hebrew verb? We do. In the Cal Imperfect, we add the noun prefix, it's a noun heric prefix, to the 1CP form. And in that case, tav would be our R1 letter, noun would be R2, and shurik would be R3. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Plus, the prefix letter isn't heric. So even though we do add noun to the beginning of a verb in some situations, that doesn't seem to be the case here. Do we ever add shurik to the end of a verb? Yeah. In the Cal Perfect 3CP, we add shurik to the end of the root, but we also add shurik to the end of the Cal Imperfect 3MP and 3FP. It's just that in those situations, we also have a prefix added, and there's no prefix here. So this must be the Cal Perfect 3CP form of Natan, which generally speaking would be gave, and in English, because we need a subject in English, we would probably say they gave. But when we've got a third person verb, that is the situation where we are more likely to have an explicit subject. We're not likely usually to have an explicit subject for a second person or first person, because generally the only subject, noun, explicit subject in those cases would be the pronouns for I or you or we, something like that. So here, in this situation, we see that Natan is in the Cal Perfect 3CP conjugation. So someone or someone's gave, all right? After our verb, if we have an explicit subject, we usually will anticipate that that is the next. That's usually in the second slot in the sentence here. So what is our second word, and does it match, does it agree with na to nu as a masculine plural or feminine plural, because this is a common suffix, masculine or plural. But basically, is this word plural? If so, it could be our subject. So what we have here is we have avotenu. Avotenu, I notice the new suffix at the end, so that would be our. And it's got a yod, so whatever this word is, it's going to be plural, and this word happens to be avot. Now, avot is not a vocabulary word, but av is. Av is father. Av takes this feminine plural looking ending, even though this is still masculine, but it takes this plural looking ending because it's irregular. So for whatever reason, av becomes avot, fathers. That's confirmed by the sere yod part of this suffix, and the new part of this suffix is going to mean our, so this would be our fathers. Does our fathers work as the subject of not to new? Our fathers gave. Yeah, it matches. It's plural. Makes sense. So we probably have our fathers gave something. What did they give? Well, I've got the definite direct object marker right here. We've got the sere instead of the segel because it is not in construct with this noun. We don't see the makef here, and so in that situation, when it stands on its own, it has the longer sere vowel rather than segel. But it's still the same particle. It's still marking the definite direct object of not to new. So what did our fathers give? Well, we've got ha kesef. Ha kesef begins with a ha, with a hey. Hey patak. When I see a hey at the beginning of a Hebrew word, I think, hey, that might be the Hebrew definite article. Sure enough, the patak dagesh confirms that it is the definite article. If I pull off the hey patak dagesh, I get kesef, which is a Hebrew word that I've learned. This is the word for silver. It can also mean money. And so that would be the silver. So this would then translate as our fathers gave the silver or the money. If we look at Futato's translation here, our fathers gave the money. All right. Number 3, again, this is a long word here at the beginning of number 3. I'm just going to anticipate that it's a verb. And so if it's a verb, I should be able to ask myself, how many letters does a Hebrew verbal root have? It has 3. How many do I have? I have 5. So I've certainly got extra stuff here. Is the extra stuff added to the beginning? Is this dalet a prefix that we usually see in Hebrew? Well, we don't add dalet prefixes to any verbs that we've learned so far. So this is probably part of the root. All right, what about suffixes? Do we ever add mem to the end of a Hebrew verb? And we do add mem in the sense that we add tav segel mem to the end of Cal Perfect 2MP verbs. So is there any other time when we add, because if we take this as our suffix, well, then we've got a 3-letter root here, darash. And darash is a Hebrew verb that we've learned. I'm pretty sure this is the verb for seek or inquire or search for. And so in the Cal Perfect 2MP, this would be something like you all sought, or you all looked for, something like that. And then we go to our next word. If this were a third person verb, we might expect that this next word would be our explicit subject. But since it's second person, unless this is the second person pronouns, one of them, then it's not going to be our explicit subject. So what do we make of what we've got here? Well, as I look at this word, the first thing that I notice is it begins with a lamed. If this were a lamed shava, I would be pretty certain that this is the lamed preposition, but it's not lamed shava. So as I scan through this, is there anything else that I recognize? I do see a hirik yod mem suffix, which would indicate that this is masculine plural, but that might actually disguise the word if I take that off. If I just remove the lamed sere, I have Elohim. So hopefully that's pretty easy for you to recognize Elohim here. Elohim is one of these irregular words where when you add a lamed shava preposition to the front of it, because this aleph is picky, it has a lot of particular requests that are made when other letters are added. And so in this case, when you add a preposition to Elohim, instead of the shava, you're going to get a sere here. So this is simply for God or to God. You all searched for God. All right, and so what do we have next? We have bechol. All right, now I say bechol and not bechal because chol here is from kol. Kol is the word for each or every or all, but it's in construct, and so when it's in construct, the holum is going to reduce to a kametz chatuf. And I know that this is a kametz chatuf because it is in a closed syllable, and this makef tells me that it's in construct, or it's unaccented. Since it's unaccented in a closed syllable, this symbol in a closed unaccented syllable will always be kametz chatuf. All right, so I've got the bait preposition at the beginning. Bait means in, with, or at. It can mean a lot of different things. Then I've got all of in construct. Then I've got libo techem. Libo techem, we got a lot of unwrapping to do. This is like one of the presents that my grandma used to put like 80 yards of tape around to make it hard to get into. We've got a lot going on. So at the beginning, we've got a lamed hirik. This is not a lamed shava, which would be a dead giveaway for a lamed preposition. So let's hold on to that. Then we've got this chem. Not only chem, we've got a chem. This a chem suffix we should recognize. This was the suffix for second masculine plural possession. So you're possessing whatever this is. All right, so if we take off the achem, we get libot. Now, libot still looks a little unusual, but it does have a holem vav tav ending, and that is the feminine plural ending. So if we take that off, we're left with lib. Now, we can't really get much better than that. This is tricky because this particular noun is what we call a geminate. Its root has 3 letters. The second letter and the third letter are identical. And in that situation, whenever you add a suffix to a geminate, or generally when you add a suffix to a geminate, weird things happen with that second and third root letter. And one of the things that commonly happens is they collapse into one with a doggish forte. So if we were to expand this bait, and we know that this is a doggish forte, because the letter containing the doggish is immediately preceded by a vowel sound. This would only be a weak doggish, if this letter bait were immediately preceded by a consonantal sound, usually a silent shava, where the consonantal sound is whatever letter is holding the silent shava. So we know this is a doubling doggish. If it's a doubling doggish, we can think about what roots have we learned, lamed bait bait. So this is from lavav. Now lavav, when it's on its own, will often just collapse into lave, but when you're adding suffixes, this shifts to lib whatever. So here it would be libot. That would be the plural form of lave. Lave or lavav means heart. Libot means hearts. Libotechem means your hearts. So if this is your hearts, we then get you all sought for God. You all searched after, sought after, or sought. You all sought for God. You all looked for God. This is one of those. It's sort of awkward because we understand that when we translate this in English, we usually have this look for idea. And so the lamed here seems redundant because we've already got this for idea in the verb. but that's just Hebrew works differently than English does. So we don't need to double translate for. We can just say, you all looked for or you all sought for God in all of your hearts, at all of your hearts, or with all of your hearts. Most likely the bait here is instrumental. It is or we could call it manner. It's not that you used all of your hearts as an instrument. This is describing the manner in which you sought God. The manner in which you sought God was a manner with all of your heart. All right, so you all sought for God with all of your hearts. Again, hearts is plural. You sought for God with all your hearts. There you go. All right, let's look at number 4 here. We have La Kahu et Ha-Zahav El Arechem. La Kahu, that's very tricky to say, but it should jump out at you pretty well what the root of this is. Anytime your suffix is a shurik, it's pretty easy to identify here. So when do we add a shurik to a Hebrew verbal root? We do that in the Cal Perfect 3CP form. Again, we also do that in the Cal Imperfect in the third masculine and feminine plural forms, but those also have prefixes. Since we don't have a prefix here, we know that this is lakach in the Cal Perfect 3CP form, which would mean something like took or seized. It is third person, so we can anticipate that we might have an explicit subject here after the verb. Our next word is et, which indicates the definite direct object, so we don't have an explicit subject. So in English, we're going to have to translate la kahu as they or they all took or they seized. Because in English we have to have an explicit subject, all right? So they seized. What did they seize? Et ha-zahav. We don't translate, it just marks the definite direct object. Ha-zahav, of course, this is my definite article, hey patak dagesh. If I take that off, I get zahav, which is gold. So they took the gold. El is a preposition here. This is not the word for God. If God is in this shortened form, it's going to be ale. The only time you're going to get, and of course, here's the exception, which does make it ambiguous. The only time you're going to get L with the segel here for God is when it's in construct. And of course, you could consider that to be the case here. But I will tell you that this is going to be the preposition to or toward. And we kind of know that just because it comes right after Zahab. So this would have to be the gold of the God of your cities. I mean, it's not terrible. It's possible, I suppose, that this could be they took the gold belonging to the God of the cities of you, or of them, rather. They took the gold of the God of their cities. That, I guess, is a possible translation. And context would have to help you decide whether that is the proper translation or whether, more likely, the translation here is that this is the to or toward preposition. They took the gold to their cities. All right, so that is probably what it is. Again, hem is going to be 3MP, and then it's got a yod here, so we know that this might be a little bit tricky and hidden for you here, because arim is the plural form of ir. Ir would be ayin, hirik yod, resh. And this looks very different. This has changed the hirik yod for the kamets. But it does mean cities, and it means their cities. So they took the gold to their cities. All right, number 5, again, we're going to assume that we've got a verb here. We've got a lot more than 3 letters. We've got 5, so something is extra. Do we ever add a hey as a prefix to a verb? Well, we'll get there, but we haven't learned that so far. So hey is probably part of the root. Do we ever add a noon? Or, since we've got 2 extra letters, a tav segel noon? Yeah, in the Cal Perfect, in the 2... Yes, I have to remember second or third. In the 2M, or this one, the noon, the 2FP form, we add the tav segel noon here to halach. So halach means went or walked. The 10 means that it is the 2FP, so you all, feminine, you all walked or you all went. And with halach, it's very common to see a lamed on the very next word. This lamed here, because halach is a verb of motion, often motion goes in a certain direction. And here lamed is indicating either direction or destination. So lamed we will probably translate as to. Where did you go? Where did you all go? To dar heichen. Ladar heichen. That's a tricky one here. So we're already assuming we can take off the lamed. Then we get dar heichen. If we take off the chen, which we should recognize as the 2FP pronoun suffix that indicates possession when it's on a noun, this would be your, and then we can take off the sereyot as well because this indicates that the noun is plural. We get dark. Now, dark is not going to look super familiar until you realize that we can look just at the letters. And again, that's going to be tricky because we're used to seeing this as a final cough, and here it's not final, so it may not jump out at your brain. Don't feel bad if you looked at this and you couldn't figure out what it is. But dalet resh kaf is the root of derech. Derech is the word for path or road or way, something like that. So this is to your path or to your way. They walked to, or I'm sorry, this is you all. This is second person. You all walked to your path. That doesn't sound great. Ha reshaim. Oh boy, to your paths, first off. This is plural. Ha reshaim. So here we've got a hey at the beginning of a Hebrew word, and I think, hey, that might be the definite article. I look for the patak dagesh to confirm, and I don't see a patak dagesh, I see a kametz, but that makes sense because resh cannot take a dagesh. And so the patak lengthens to a kametz to compensate for the loss of the dagesh. If I take off the hey kametz, I get reshaim. Now, reshaim has the im ending, the im suffix, which would be masculine plural. If I take off the im suffix, I get resh shen ayin. And again, if you pay attention to the letters in your vocabulary especially, vowels are important, vowels are helpful, but make sure you're recognizing the letters themselves because these vowels change a lot. If I look at resh shen ayin, this is an adjective that we've learned, and this adjective means wicked or guilty. We're going to go with wicked in this sense. Guilty is usually a personal adjective. It usually describes a person, whereas wicked could describe a person or a thing. So here, we've got the adjective wicked. It's masculine plural, so it has to modify a masculine plural noun. Sure enough, derech in darchechen would be masculine plural. So this is going to be you all went or walked to your wicked ways. That doesn't sound great in English. I would probably say you walked according to your wicked ways. That would be about as literal as I could keep it and still have it feel like it's good English. So let's see what Futato says. You went on your wicked ways. And then he notes that halach, this is confusing because it's backwards. Halach plus the lamed preposition equals the idea of to go on. So you went on your wicked ways. Again, I'm not sure what that means. Like, is he suggesting that ways here is the more literal idea of a path? All right, number 6 here, we've got Ra'inu et sif reha. Ra'inu, this is, again, a little bit, this is not familiar, but what is familiar is this new suffix. Okay, when do we add new to the end of a verb? Well, we do that in the cal perfect, in the 1CP form. We have not seen new as a suffix in the imperfect. So this must be cal perfect 1CP. All right, so if we take this off, we're left with resh aleph yod. And remember I said one of these rules in Hebrew. If you get to your Hebrew root and the third root letter is a yod, assume it's a third hey verb. Okay? Now, assume and check. Make sure it makes sense as a third hey verb, but let that be a clue to you that you're looking at third hey. So if I replace this yod with a hey, I get resh aleph hey. That is a verbal root that I've learned. Ra'ah is the Hebrew word for see. So Ra'ah plus the cal perfect 1CP would be we saw. All right? So we saw here, what did we see? 8 sifreha. All right? Now this also looks very unfamiliar. What can I take apart? What can I undo in this word to get back to something that is familiar? Well, I've got the hey kametz suffix. And I remember that hey suffix, especially with the hey kametz in that order, that is the 3fs possessive suffix that goes on plural nouns. And that yod here confirms that whatever this noun is, it is plural. Now, if I look at the vowels, it's not going to look familiar, but if I ignore those and I just look at the letters, sigma, pe, resh, where have I seen that root? I've seen it in the noun sefer. Sefer is the word for book or document or scroll. And so book is a very modern, Books as we know them, what are called codices or a codex, this almost certainly did not exist when the Hebrew Bible was written. So think scroll, think document. Here, this is going to be her documents or scrolls, plural. So this would be we saw her documents. We saw her scrolls. We saw her books. Okay, that's fine. I mean, books in a broad sense. Again, don't think books like we have today. That didn't exist back then, but good enough. All right, so that's C. Let's look at D here. We're going to do some parsing. And again, you've got the parsings back there. I'll just point out what I'm seeing here as kind of like my shortcuts to point me in the right direction. So number one, we've got ga'alu. I immediately recognize this shuric suffix, so I'm thinking 3CP. If I take that off, I get ga'al, which, sure enough, is a verb that I've learned. Ga'al is he redeemed in the Cal Perfect 3MP. Here it's got a shuric, so it's they redeemed. Next, I've got ta'amod. Ta'amod has 4 letters. Dalet is not a suffix I'm used to seeing, but tav is a prefix in the Cal Imperfect, third feminine singular, and third feminine plural, and second person. So third feminine and second person, we have a tav prefix. In the singular is where we get no suffix. So this is either Cal Imperfect 3fs or 2ms of amad. Number 3, we've got essa. In this situation, I have 3 letters, but it doesn't make sense that these are my 3 root letters. For one, I've not learned the root aleph, sin, aleph. Secondly, the vowels are off for a Cal Perfect 3ms. It also, I know that this lesson was before we learned infinitives, but if you think of this as an infinitive, it doesn't make sense either, because infinitives we would expect to see either a kametz for an infinitive absolute or a shava in this first letter for an infinitive construct. So none of that makes sense. So what about prefixes and suffixes? Do I ever add aleph as a suffix? I've not seen aleph as a suffix before. What about as a prefix? Well, yes, actually, aleph segel is a prefix in the Cal Imperfect 1CS form. So if I take that off, I'm left with sin, kametz, aleph. But this sin has a strong doubling dagesh here. Anytime you remove a prefix before a dagesh, think one noon, or at least one noon family, okay? The reason why, because again, we haven't learned any verbs that stick a dagesh into the verb. We will run across them, but for now, just know that this dagesh here, this is a good indication. A dagesh after a prefix right now is a good indication of a one noon imperfect. All right, so if I take off the prefix and I put a noon back on here, I get noon, sen, aleph. That is nasa. Nasa is he lifted up, he went up, something like that. Brought up, took up. Could mean a lot of different things. I think of Nassau, lift off, take off, going up. Nassau. But here it's in the Cal Imperfect 1CS form. So that would be we will lift up. All right, number 4, again, 5 letters. So what are my prefixes and suffixes? Bait preposition is a possibility for an infinitive, but this is not an infinitive form. So let's look at suffixes, and we've got the tem suffix. Now, we're used to this tem suffix having a dagesh in it, but that's only because we're used to the tem suffix coming after a letter with a silent shavah in it, in which case, a bagad kafat letter like tav, after a silent shavah, is going to have the weak dagesh. Here, it's not after a consonant sound. It's not after a silent shavah. It's after a vowel sound, and so it loses the weak dagesh in that situation. Tem indicates Cal Perfect 2MP, and that gives us bait kaf yod as a root, but remember, when you get to a third yod in your root, think third hey, baka. Baka would be he wept, this would be you all wept. Number 5, this is a little bit unusual. We've got a shurik here. Shurik toward the beginning of a verb, especially shurik after a prefix. This is a good indication that you're looking at a specific type of one yod vav. Now this, we learned just kind of on its own. This is the verb yakol. Yakol in the perfect is a stative verb. It's also stative in the imperfect, but this would be the imperfect form because the yod here is actually the prefix yod. This is the third masculine, and we know it's singular because there's no suffix, third masculine singular form. The yod of the root here has actually reverted to the vav, and it's become, we know that a lot of one yod vavs will drop out altogether. So we've got the yod prefix with the shurik prefix vowel, because the root yod has converted to that vowel. All right, and then we've got chal. So this would be Cal Imperfect 3ms form. Number 6, we've got 4 letters. We are used to seeing noon as a prefix, but we're used to it being noon hirik. Here we've got noon holam. But when we see noon holam, when we see this holam aleph, especially the holam aleph patach pattern, we just know that certain one aleph verbs in the imperfect have some weird vowel preferences. So this is amar, and it is the Cal Imperfect 1CP form of amar. All right, next we've got ta'asu. Ta'asu is going to be a shuric suffix. That would leave us with tav, ayin, sin, but that root is not a root that we've learned before. So what else is going on here? If we've got 3 letters, but they don't work as a root, then we must have lost something and replaced it with something else. So what is the it's easier to find the replacement first. So what is the replacement that's hiding the missing letter? Well, it's not going to be sin, because we don't add sin as a suffix, but we do add tav as a prefix. Now we usually add tav hirik, but that doesn't work here because we've got a 1 guttural. And where we usually have a tav hirik, the next letter usually will have a shavah, and these gutturals, they don't like shavahs. And so what happens here is we get the tav prefix. The ayin guttural prefers, instead of a shavah, to have a hatef, and ayin in particular prefers a hatef patach. And then the tav, it complements, it uses the corresponding short vowel of the hatef vowel. So that's why we have this patach, hatef patach pattern. This is still Cal Imperfect. It's still a tav prefix with a shuric suffix, which can only be a 2MP form. But if we take both of these off, then we've only got ayin sin. So what is missing? Are we missing something from the beginning, the R1? The only time we miss something from R1, the only time that our first root letter goes missing in the imperfect is a 1 yod, which isn't happening, because then we would expect the sere sere or patak patak or sometimes segel segel pattern. That's not what we have. Or a 1 noon. Now, a 1 noon would usually assimilate, and the ayin here can't take a dagesh, so maybe that's a possibility. But in that case, we have that could work if there were a Hebrew root naas. I think that this maybe could work, but even in that situation, I think you would still have a hirik here. I'm pretty sure. So that doesn't work. Well, when else do we lose a letter? So if it's not 1 yod or 1 noon, when else do we lose a letter? Well, we lose a letter for third hay, and that's what this is. So this is asa. Asa is the verb for he made, but it is in the Cal Imperfect 2MP form, so you all will make. When we have a third hay verb and we add a vocalic suffix, the third hay just drops off completely. When we add a consonantal suffix, that is a suffix that begins with a consonant, the hay is going to shift to a yod. But when it's a vocalic suffix that begins with a vowel, then it just drops off altogether. All right, number 8, we've got kaved. This is the lexical form. It's a little unusual because it's a kametz sere pattern instead of kametz patach, but that's because kaved is a stative verb, and it's a sere stative verb, an E-class stative verb. And so in the 3ms form, this is what it looks like. So this is just Cal Perfect 3ms of kaved. Number 9, we have yakolta. Yakolta is pretty close to the lexical form yakol, but it's got the ta suffix, so this is 2ms. So this would then be you, masculine singular, were able or are able. And then number 10, we have te shavi. Te shavi has 4 letters, so what's extra? Well, hirik yod certainly is not part of the root. We don't have any Hebrew verbs that end with hirik yod. And this isn't a third hay, because third hay only shifts to hirik yod when you add a consonantal suffix. So this hirik yod must be one of the hirik yod conjugations, and that's either Cal Perfect 1CS, which actually is tav hirik yod, so that's not what we have here, or it is Cal Imperfect 2FS, in which case we have a tav prefix and a hirik yod suffix. So, if we take those off, the tav prefix and the hirik yod suffix, we're left with 2 letters. We don't have 3, so we've got another letter missing. We already talked about how it's not a third hay, so it's not a hay missing from the end. So if it's missing from the beginning, it would be either a 1 yod or it would be a 1 noon. If it's a 1 noon, we would expect a dagesh in the next letter, and we don't have that here. So Must this then be a one yod? Well, remember, if it's a one yod vav, we get a sere sere pattern. Now, we don't have a sere sere pattern, but we do have a sere, and the reason why we don't have a sere under this second letter is because we've added a hirik yod to the end. When you add a vowel to the end of a Hebrew word, it messes with the syllables, and so this syllable has to reduce now. So it would be, if we didn't have the hirik yod ending, if this were 2ms, it would be teshev. But here, because we've added the E, this now has to reduce. The sere has to reduce to a shava, and we get teshevi. So this is the Cal imperfect 2fs form of yashav, which would become yeshev in the 3ms of the Cal imperfect, and teshev in the 3fs or 2ms, and teshevi in the 2fs. All right, so looking at section E now, translating these. Again, what I'm going to do is you've got the translations. I'm just going to go through what I see here to kind of tip me to how to get back to the root here. So, barati, bara, obviously, it's kamets instead of kamets patach, because the third aleph quiesces, which basically means think of this as the silhouette of the aleph, or the shadow. It's not there anymore. It can't close that syllable, and since this is an accented syllable that's open, Hebrew prefers a long vowel here, and that's why you get, well, again, Futato calls kamets a medium vowel, but anyways, it prefers the kamets because the aleph is open. And then we've got the T suffix, which is that one CS in the Cal perfect. Number 2, we've got 4 letters, but very unrecognizable. Certainly the shurik comes off. Then we've got yod, gimel, ayin. We don't recognize that as a root, but yod hirik does look like a prefix. If we take that off, we note, now again, it's a begad kafat letter, so, it could be a weak dagesh, but here this is the strong dagesh, indicating a one noon, naga, so that would be 3CP, Cal imperfect. Number 3, we have lo in front of a Cal perfect 2MP. That's the tem ending is Cal perfect 2MP. And then we end up with asi with the third yod. But remember, third yod should point you back to third hey. So this is a sa. Number 4, we have neda. This is 3 letters, which is good news except for the fact that it can't be Cal perfect because that would be kamets patach. And this is not kamets patach, this is sere patach. So when else would we get 3 letters? Well, we could get 3 letters with an imperfect that is missing something. So noon is a prefix that we encounter in the imperfect, but it's usually noon hirik. So when does noon hirik shift to noon sere? Well, when we have a one yod vav, that yod will drop out. We get a sere sere pattern, which we would have here, except the ayin prefers the A class vowel. So the ayin says, no, give me the patach, and so we get a sere patach pattern. But this is the Cal imperfect 1CP form, indicated by the noon, of the one yod vav yada. Number 5, baninu. Here we get the new suffix. We take that off and we get what looks like a third yod. If it looks like a third yod, make it a third hey. Bana, he built. This would be we built. Number 6, tochal. Again, 4 letters. Lamed certainly isn't a suffix. Tav does work as a prefix, but we've got a holam. Anytime you see holam, holam, aleph, patach, you should just recognize this is one of those one aleph verbs that likes to switch up the vowels. So the tav tells us either third feminine singular, because there is no suffix, third feminine singular, or second masculine singular, Cal imperfect of achal. So this would be either she will eat, or you, masculine singular, will eat. Number 7, lo ya'aleh. So lo again is going to negate whatever this verb is. Looking at this, we've got 4 letters. The end is segel hey. Segel hey is what we expect the end of a Cal imperfect of a third hey verb to look like if there's no suffix. So yod makes sense as a Cal imperfect prefix, but then we've got the patach. But the patach can be explained, along with the hatef patach, by the one ayin, which prefers the patach vowel. It doesn't like to have just a shavah here, so it goes with the hatef vowel. Plus it has a preference for A class, which is why you get the patach, ayin, hatef patach. All right, number 8, we've got tisa. So this is 3 letters, but it can't be Cal perfect 3ms because of the vowels. It's also not one of these one yod vavs where you get the sere sere pattern, because there's no sere sere pattern. But tav is a prefix, especially tav hirik. That is a prefix we're used to. So if I take that off, I'm left with 2 letters, but one of them has a dagesh. So that's a good sign that we've got a noon that has assimilated, nasa. Nasa is he lifted up, or he went up, not he went up, but he took up, or he lifted up. Tisa would then be either she will lift up, or you will lift up. All right, number 9, yomru. 5 letters, shuric is certainly a suffix. If we take that off, we get yomr. This was a patak. It had to get reduced to a shava because of the shuric. We added a vowel to the end. This was a patak, so we get the holum aleph patak form. Yomar is going to be he will say, but yomru with the shuric suffix makes it plural. So this would be they, masculine plural, will say. Number 10, lo elade. Again, seri seri pattern. That tells me that I've got an aleph prefix on a 1 yod vav. Yod lamed dalet would be yalad, to beget. So the aleph prefix here would mean I will beget, but it's lo, so it's I will not beget. Number 11, lo natatem. Lo natatem. Lo natatem. The accent would be on the final syllable here. Lo natatem. If you can't tell, this is natan, but the noon has assimilated into the tem suffix. So this would be you all gave, but it's negated. You all did not give. Number 12, we've got nuchal here. We've got 4 letters. Lamed certainly is not part of a suffix, but noon can be a prefix. We're used to seeing noon hirik, and here we have noon shurik, but this is because the 1 yod has reverted to a vav and become part of the prefix vowel. This is the irregular state of verb yachol in the cal imperfect 1CP form. If yachol is he is able, this would be we will be able. 13, we've got yivche. Yivche has 4 letters, but it's got a segel hey ending. And segel hey is how we would expect a third hey verb to end in the cal imperfect if it doesn't have a suffix. So if we have beit kaf hey, that is a verb root we've learned, bacha, he wept, the yod hirik prefix makes it he will weep. Number 14, we've got lo nira. Nira is 4 letters. Ayin is certainly part of the root. That's not a suffix that we add. But noon hirik, that is a prefix that we're used to in the cal imperfect 1CP. Of course, this is not noon hirik. This is noon hirik yod. But that hirik yod prefix vowel is what we expect in a true 1 yod in the cal imperfect conjugation. So if yara is he is afraid or he feared, then nira would be we will be afraid or we will fear, but it's negated. We will not be afraid or we will not fear. And then finally, number 15, bara. This is just the lexical form that we learned. Bara is he created. Pretty straightforward. All right, so number 3, again, I'm going to assume that this very long word at the beginning is a verb. And so if I'm looking at this as a verb, and it's not a verb as I read it, so what do you know? But let's just go through this. Let's pretend like I don't recognize this. If this is a verb, what am I looking at here? Well, do I ever have a tav suffix? I do. I do get a tav suffix in a third hey verb. Sorry, it's not third hey. We'll get there. I do get just a tav suffix in the cal perfect 2fs. The 2ms is tav kametz, ta, but the 2fs is just a tav. Now, we usually see it as a tav with a dagesh and a shava, but that's only because usually when you put that 2fs suffix on a verb in the cal perfect, it's coming after a letter with a silent shava, and that's not what we have here. So this could be a sign of the cal perfect 2fs, and the reason why I said third hey before is because then we would end up with, now there's a lot going on, but if this were a third hey, and we have a consonantal suffix, that would explain the hirik yod. But that would then mean that if hirik yod represents the third hey, then the shin would have to be the second root letter, and aleph doesn't get added, so that would have to be the first root letter, and then we'd have to have beit resh as a prefix. Now, beit could be maybe a preposition somehow, but resh, like, this just doesn't work. It doesn't work to call this cal perfect 2fs on account of the tav. All right, well, if that doesn't work, when else do we end with a tav? Well, we end with a T in the cal perfect 1CS, we end with a tem in the cal perfect 2MP, and we end with a 10 in the cal perfect 2FP, but that's not what we have. We don't have any of those here. We just have a tav. So this isn't a suffix then, it would seem. If this isn't a suffix, then maybe this is a root letter, which means somehow we've got a hirik yod in here, and we still end up with having too many letters. There are just too many letters in this word to explain a verb conjugation. So at that point we say, okay, well, maybe this isn't a verb, even though we anticipate it. And that's why I say we anticipate. We don't demand that the first word is a verb. Sometimes the first word is not the main verb, but some sort of temporal phrase. That's what we have here. So if we're just looking across, you're only going to be able to recognize this if you've learned this vocabulary word. If you haven't learned it, what do you do? Because in second year, you're still not going to know every word in Hebrew, but you're going to be in your Hebrew Bible, and you're going to need to know what to do when you run across a word that you don't recognize. So what I would recommend in this situation is you look at this, and you've got a couple possibilities. It's always best to start at the beginning if you've already worked through suffixes and prefixes and everything, because in your lexicon, you look up words starting at the beginning. So you're either going to start under beit and start looking up beit, resh, ayin, shin, yod, tav, just alphabetically, or you might recognize that beit shavah, beit shavah could easily be the preposition beit. And if we take this off, well, then we would have reshit left. Now, I don't know if you've learned reshit in your vocabulary, but if you haven't, that's still a problem. But now you can go look up resh, aleph, shin, and that will get you somewhere. That will get you to rosh. Rosh means head. It can mean chief. It can also mean, well, I don't know that it would mean first, but anyways, you can get stuff here. What you end up with is this is a form related to the root rosh, but this reshit here really just means beginning, okay? And so you've got the beit preposition plus beginning. So in beginning, at beginning, that's basically what you've got here. But that is a temporal phrase. It's situating the action of the verb in time. At beginning, okay? Now in English, just the way English works, we say at the beginning. At this point, you can probably tell what we're looking at here. In beginning, created. All right. Now, created, this is a third-person verb here, so we might have an explicit subject. And if we do, it's usually going to be right after the verb bara. So what is our next word? Elohim. Well, Elohim, even though it looks like masculine plural, Elohim often takes a singular verb, and this is masculine. So at beginning, God created, because English puts the subject in front of the verb, although Hebrew often will put the subject after the verb. Created what? Ate ha-shamayim. See a hey at the beginning of a Hebrew word, you think, hey, that might be the Hebrew definite article. Sure enough, the Patak Dagesh confirms, if I take those off, I get shamayim, which is the word for heaven. So in the beginning, God created the heaven, the eight, and another definite article. So this has a another definite article, another direct object. This sentence has a compound direct object. There are basically two direct objects. Ha'aretz. So, hey, I see a hey at the beginning of a Hebrew word. Hey, that might be the definite article. I would expect a Patak Dagesh, but here I've got an Aleph, and Aleph can't take a Dagesh, so the Patak lengthens to a Kametz. I can't explain to you why the Segel of Aretz goes to a Kametz as well, because I don't think this always happens with Segel nouns, but I may be wrong. But I will tell you that anytime the singular noun Eretz has the definite article, it's going to be Aretz, I think. Okay. The eight, so there's another definite direct object, ha-adam. Ha-adam means mankind or humanity. The eight, ha-behema. This would mean like ha-behema is like the large animals. All right, so we've got at beginning, God created. What did he create? The heaven and the earth and humanity and the large animals. In the beginning, God created the heavens, the earth, humanity, and the animals. So there you go. Hopefully that's helpful. If you have any questions, send them my way. Hope you're having a great week. Take care, guys.